We will focus today on the key provisions of the Interoperable Europe Act and on the assessments and where you can find related information. So this is an introduction. But before going into the details of today's sessions, I would like to share with you some of the announcements. Exactly. So I mentioned that the recording will be available on our portal, and I meant Interoperable Europe Portal. And this is changed because we used to have Join Up, and Join Up no longer exists. It is Interoperable Europe Portal, and there you will find related resources. That is not only change. We evolved from better legislation for smoother implementation, BLSI community, to digital-ready policymaking community. So you can see the old logo with the laptop and the scales, and now it is no longer in use. It is digital-ready policymaking, and we are organizing this webinar. And there is also a new space dedicated to interoperability assessments. So if you're interested in this particular topic, you will find all resources there, including guidance and also webinars and events related to this topic. So if you want to know more on this, you can become a member of this space, the collection on Interoperable Europe Portal. And if not, you're interested in more broad topic of digital-ready policymaking, you can become a member of our collection. And of course, you can become a member of both. There is no limitations. And we made these changes to further align with the Interoperable Europe Act. So it also promotes digital-ready policy setup, and we would like to further align with these requirements. And when we go to the next slide, you will already see Slido, because also our part is our mission is to serve you better. So we would like to know more. What would you like to hear more in the future sessions? So please access Slido. You can see the QR code, and I hope that also you will see the link in the chat to the Slido with the code. And that is all for the announcements. We can go to the agenda now, and I would like to finally introduce my esteemed speaker. We have today Maria Leck. She's a team leader in DG Digit at the Commission. She's an expert on the Interoperable Europe Act. She was involved in the drafting of this legislation and is now focusing on implementation and governance of the Interoperable Europe Act, and she will give you an overview of the key provisions. And then we have Felicitas Biesenhofer. She's policy officer, also at DG Digit at the Commission, and she's one of the parents of the interoperability assessments. And that's why she will also introduce you to this topic. And my name is Eva Zylia. I work also in Digit at the Commission, and I am leading digital-ready policymaking community. And a small note, if there are colleagues from the Commission, we have a webinar tomorrow internally for you, focusing on the implementation of the assessments at the Commission. So if you want to know more on this topic, tomorrow at 12 it will take place. You can reach me via our internal channels to know more. And to all participants, we highly invite you to ask your questions in the chat during the session. We will try to answer all of them. If it is not possible during the presentation, we will try to get back to them in the Q&A part of this presentation. You will also have a possibility to raise your hand and ask your question by yourself. And with that, I will pass over the floor to Maria. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva. Good morning, everyone. I'm really glad to be here and seeing also over 100 participants. So it's very good to see the interest for the interoperability assessments. This is the introductory webinar for this, and Felicitas will go more in depth. I mean, many of you probably know what the Interoperable Europe Act is about. But since we are quite numerous today, then I will take just 5 minutes to go quickly through what the Act is about. And then the next 5 minutes, I will tell you what has been happening and what is coming in terms of implementing the Act. And after this, we will go to the North Star of today's webinar, which is the assessments. So on the next slide, you will see, I mean, the Act itself was really developed to help public administrations to deliver seamless public services that work across border, across sectors in the EU. But not only, I'm sure you all follow what's been happening also in terms of the new Commission priorities, in terms of the simplification, burden reduction, and we believe that the Act also has a very important role in making the EU's regulatory environment simpler and faster through consistent application of digital-ready and interoperability by default principles. Because essentially the Act is really about making sure that interoperability is not an afterthought, that is thought about when you already have to implement, but already is thought about when new legislation is being developed and designed. In scope of the Act are not just member state public administrations, but also all the EU entities that manage or provide trans-European digital public services. And the Act entered into force in April last year and is now fully applicable as of January this year. So in the next slide, you will see the key pillars of the Act through which we want to deliver on what we have promised. So the first important component is that the Act really establishes a cooperation framework for EU public administrations to build a secure cross-border exchange of data and agree on shared reusable interoperability solutions. And some of these solutions will be labeled as Interoperable Europe solutions. So this will be a kind of a quality label for a small number of solutions that we really want to promote uptake across the EU, and these solutions will be made available in the Interoperable Europe Portal. Then secondly, the Act really introduces quite significant measures to support and provide technical assistance to the public administrations for the digital implementation of EU law. So an example of this, two examples actually, are the regulatory sandboxes, which kind of create a safe control space for testing new innovative solutions when developing new public services. And the goal is really to promote regulatory learning. And then the second tool is policy implementation support projects. I mean, interoperability solutions are already used in different union policies like the data spaces, e-invoicing, e-tax systems, but in the future this will be really stepped up to make sure that there is more support for public administration, more technical assistance to implement EU law. And still with the support, we also through the Act stimulate public sector innovation through public-private cooperation. It's called COFTE. I'm sure you're familiar with the term. And in COFTE, basically the public sector works together with SMEs, with the private sector to develop innovative solutions for public administrations to use. On the governance, I already mentioned that this is really at the heart of the Act, but the Interoperable Europe Board is established, and this gathers together all the member state chief information officers to agree on the strategic direction where we want to go. Importantly for you is also that it introduces national competent authorities in each member state that help to oversee the implementation of the Act. And we will also launch an Interoperable Europe community. And last but not least, the real topic of today is that it introduces mandatory interoperability assessments whenever trans-European digital public services are being set up and requirements established, so that barriers to cross-border interoperability could be detected really early on when designing digital public services. Now, this is it for the short overview in terms of what are the key provisions. I now will go to the highlights in the next slide. So what's happened in 24, because the Act entered into force in April. Just some points to highlight is that we have a really high level representation at the Interoperable Europe Board from the member state side, with secretaries of state, deputy secretaries of state, directors of agencies responsible for digitization. They met for the first time already in December, and it's really a very nice crowd. We have a dedicated space in the portal on the governance. You can see the minutes of the meeting there, and there was also quite a lot of hype going on in LinkedIn after the first meeting. Then we are at the moment collecting nominations for national competent authorities. We have received most of them, but soon these will be also made available in the Interoperable Europe Portal, so you know who is the contact point in your country. And also the EU entities have nominated their interoperability coordinators, so 41. It's over half of the entities that exist. So this is great. We have a new network of collaborators, let's say. Very important in the middle, with the interoperability assessments, we also kind of change how policies are made at the European Commission, because the digital-ready policymaking framework will be used to implement the interoperability assessments at the Commission. And basically this means that future Commission proposals will be accompanied by a legislative financial digital statement that includes information on what are the expected digital implications related to that proposal. So leading to much smoother implementation in the future. And also towards the member states, we have published the interoperability assessment guidelines. The board adopted them in December, and Felicitas will tell you more about this. These were really co-designed with a group of member states and endorsed by all of them. So huge work we did last year. Already Emma mentioned that the portal has been launched, and also at least the member state audience that we have here, we have launched from the digital program also coordination and support action to support member states in implementing the act, in kind of identifying what are the member state needs to ensure that it's implemented in a better way. And they will have their kickoff actually tomorrow already. So this is also a very exciting project to last in 25. And now the next slide, what is coming? So I mentioned already a couple of things for Q1 25. Maybe the new component is that we will launch also an independent expert group that will do some high-level strategic reflection on where the next generation European interoperability framework should go. It's an independent expert group where up to 9 experts will be chosen in their personal capacity to provide independent advice to the Commission. I mean, eventually it is the Interoperable Europe Board that has to make a proposal for the Commission for the new EIF. Let's say this is additional support to get some out-of-the-box ideas to make sure that the EIF, the next EIF, will be more relevant, more embedded in the new policies, takes into account the new technological advancements. For Q2, let's say in May, we are planning to publish a study report that gathers all the findings to support the implementation of the assessments. We have done this with a great partner, and all this year we have been having workshops, a lot of desk research to really see how to support the implementation of the assessment. So this report will be extremely interesting, and there will be also new training courses related to the assessments, for example. Maybe the last point that I want to mention is that in June 25, we are planning to launch the consultation of the Interoperable Europe agenda. So again, the Interoperable Europe Board has been tasked to kind of put together their vision on the priorities and key steps for ensuring cross-border interoperability and the solutions that needs to be developed in this kind of document. And we want to launch a public consultation that addresses precisely the community, you here, to understand what are the needs for future development of solutions, for the support, for more synergies. So this is something really to look forward to. But since the time is limited, I will stop here. The slides will be shared with you afterwards. And with this, I will give the floor to Felicitas. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I hope you can hear me. I'm going to take over for the next point of interoperability assessments because, as Eva so aptly mentioned, I've been working on them for quite some time now. So I want to go a little bit into what interoperability assessments are and what support actually exists. And as probably a lot of you know, the interoperability assessments are a recent obligation under the Interoperable Europe Act, and they entered into force on January 12th, so actually exactly 17 days ago. And they have three main components. They assess the effects on interoperability or cross-border interoperability. They are to be consulting with stakeholders, and they will check solutions for reuse. But maybe you'll ask yourself, why did we come up with this instrument in the first place? We want policymakers to actually think about interoperability from the beginning, and Maria has already mentioned this, but we actually see interoperability assessments as part of a bigger change process in that sense that you think before you act, and acting in this sense means writing new legislation or changing or substantially modifying existing legislation. And in that change process, the goal is to identify barriers to cross-border interoperability at a very early stage in the policymaking process, and therefore make the implementation of the digital public services easier later. And those are obviously digital public services that require cross-border data exchange, because we're talking about cross-border interoperability. And in doing so, we hoped that interoperability assessments help to reduce the gap between policy design and IT implementation, which sounds fancy, but basically means that when you design a policy, that there will be consultation with people from the IT department, for example, from the very beginning. So you write a legislation that will not make them question their life when they try to implement it, so that you consider digital and interoperability aspects from the outset. And lastly, this also includes promoting the reuse of common interoperability solutions and user centricity, meaning that policies also become more sustainable, actually, because reusing of common interoperability solutions is not only a nice to have thing, it actually saves time and resources. And in this sense, it's also a tool for a change of mindset, in a sense, because it actually aims at better planning of legislation and therefore better digital implementation. It aims at digital-ready policymaking, so designing a policy with the digital implementation of it in mind, and therefore also interoperability by design. It's to save resources, whether that's time, money, or actually human resources. And in the end, this hopefully leads to better user experience, because actually when you move across the EU, you will be able to easily access digital public services that you need. For example, if you take your spouse or your kids with you, or you try to get your professional diplomas accredited in another country. And obviously there's a very legal obligation that comes with this. So public sector bodies or union entities that are intending to set binding requirements have to assess three components that I mentioned at the very beginning. They have to assess the effects of binding requirements on cross-border interoperability. They have to consult with the stakeholders to which the binding requirements are relevant. And they have to assess the Interoperable Europe solutions that support the implementation, and then summarize the outcome of this assessment in a report, which is highlighted in the annex of the regulation, which basically lays out the features of a report. And this is all very abstract for now, but it has some basic principles behind it as well. We want interoperability assessments to be proportionate and differentiated for the level and the scope at which they take place, which basically means that if you do an interoperability assessment on a legislation that will later on be implemented, for example, at the local and regional level, that your interoperability assessment will probably look very different than when you do a later one on the implementation itself, which will happen at a smaller scale. And for all of this, we use the European Interoperability Framework as a support tool, where Maria also already mentioned that there will be a new version for now, but the basic principles and recommendations and the way it explains interoperability will stay the same. And as I mentioned, this was very abstract and very legal, so I would like to focus now on what actually triggers an assessment. So we know what it's supposed to be in the assessment, but when do I actually do it? And the legal act says that before taking a decision on new or substantially modified binding requirements, this assessment needs to happen. So two things need to happen. We need to be early enough in the process, and we need to be assessing a binding requirement. And I think it's relatively easy to understand what before taking a decision means, so that we're early enough in the policymaking process, yes. But what does a binding requirement actually mean? And here it gets a little bit not necessarily complicated, but more in-depth, because a binding requirement can be an obligation, a prohibition, condition, criterion, or limit of a legal, organizational, semantic, or technical nature, which basically means it's something that limits the choice left to others in the 4 layers of interoperability that we use as per the European Interoperability Framework. And it needs to be set by a union entity or a public sector body. This binding requirement needs to concern 1 or more trans-European digital public services, and it needs to have an effect on cross-border interoperability. This still is rather abstract, so maybe let's get a little bit more into it, what it means in practice. So, as I said, before taking a decision should be the obligation at the beginning of the legislative cycle. And then it can be that you have to do an interoperability assessment at a later point again, but for now, it should be at the beginning of the legislative cycle. Any binding requirement means that it limits the choices that are left to others. For example, by mandating a specific format for data, other entities or organizations cannot choose to present or send or store their data in a different way. And this is actually very, very important because it also sets the limit for when an interoperability assessment needs to happen, because you don't have to do an interoperability assessment if, for example, you only do evolutive maintenance of a service. So if you do a security update, or if you do a technical update, or you just procure equipment for a service, you don't have to do an assessment. It's only when it limits the choices of others. And then also a binding requirement needs to be within the limits of a trans-European digital public service. And that usually means that this service requires interaction across member state borders. And I've listed some examples here. For example, the recognition of academic diplomas would be a good example. The recognition of professional qualifications, the exchange of vehicle data, or taxation or customs would also be good examples. So yes, this is still probably a lot to take in, and I'm gonna try to make it even more practical for you, so we can see what this means when you apply it, for example, to a policy that is currently in the making. And for this, I chose the European Disability and Parking Card, which I'm sure you all know that there's disability parking spots available across the entire EU. You also encounter it when you go to a museum, you go to the cinema, or in public transport, that there's discounts or benefits available to people with disabilities. But this is still mostly a national thing. So for example, when you're traveling to another member state, you often don't have access to the same services, discounts, or advantages. So if you have, for example, a disability card from Germany and you travel to Brussels, you have to get lucky that somebody recognizes your disability card, because there's no process in place. So the Commission came up with a proposal for a EU-wide disability and parking card. And this is where the interoperability assessment comes in, and we're going to have a look at it now. The first question is obviously whether we need to do an interoperability assessment or not. So let's see whether we're taking a decision on a binding requirement and whether the decision is still open. And this is actually the case, as you can see. I tried to use the same icons so you recognize things again. The European Disability and Parking Card is still a legislative proposal. So changes can still be made to the text. So we can check that we are in the before taking a decision on binding requirements. We also remember that binding requirements need to be set by a public sector body or a union entity, and the European Commission is such a union entity. So because they're setting the binding requirements per their legislative proposal, that one is also a given. The binding requirements also need to concern one or more trans-European digital public services, and such services need to be provided by public sector bodies or union entities to either one another or to natural or legal persons across the EU. And this is given here as well, because this service will be provided by national public sector bodies to their citizens, so to natural persons. And it also needs to have an effect on cross-border interoperability. And because these cards, both the disability card and the parking card, need to be valid across the EU and they need to be mutually recognized, they will most likely require interaction across borders, and therefore we have that given as well. So yay, we are in the process of taking a decision, and it's going to be on binding requirements. So we can go ahead, and I actually brought you 2 examples for binding requirements. And this is Article 5.1 of the proposal, and it states that member states shall take the necessary measures to ensure that holders of a European disability card, while they are traveling to or visiting into another member state, other than that of which they are resident, that they shall be granted access on equal terms and conditions, as those that actually live in that member state that they're traveling to. And this is a very long text. It's very legalistic, but what this is basically about is the validity of the EU disability card and parking card. What it says is that I need to be able to use it wherever I go, which means that it needs to be accepted wherever I go. And that means that there's enough information on the card and that the other member state can read that information on the card and can say no if all of the relevant information is there, and obviously if it hasn't expired yet, for example. And you can see here, this is very binding in the sense that it literally obliges member states to grant access on equal terms and conditions to whoever comes to visit and who has a EU disability or parking card. So this is one example. That would be a binding requirement. And you can also see here that this would probably be very beneficial for cross-border interoperability, because if you oblige one member state to recognize the disability card that a person from another member state has, you actually ensure that the person traveling has access to the same services that they would have at home, which is not only nice to have, but also a fundamental right. And the next example for a binding requirement is a bit more hands-on and pretty obvious, but super relevant. This is not only binding, but it actually already shows you what the EU disability card will look like. So each member state shall introduce the European disability card following the common standardized format. I copy and pasted the actual picture for you here. And you can see that each card will have a picture. It will list your first name, your last name, your date of birth. Each card will have a serial number and it will have an expiration date. So this is very, very binding, obviously, because each card has to look the same and it needs to include the same information. But this is also super beneficial for cross-border interoperability, as it is much the same as the ID cards we already have today, that wherever you go, everybody will look at this card and know the first row is the name, the second row is the surname, the third row is the date of birth, and at the very bottom you can find the expiration date for a quick check. And these are 2 examples that I wanted to show you. One that can be very prescriptive, like this card, with saying which information goes where, and that there's also binary requirements like the one that I talked about before, that set the basic ground but leave some space for how this can be implemented. And this, yeah, just a short illustration on how binding requirements can look like. what they usually look like when they're part of a legislative proposal, and what actually makes them binding, and maybe also first steps in how you can identify them. But I also understand that this is a lot of information. It's a lot of complex information. So in the next part of this presentation, I actually want to show you what kind of support is available. And as was mentioned before, we've published a collection on the Interoperable Europe Portal, which you're very, very welcome to join. It's called the Interoperability Assessment Space. We have different sections. Obviously, there's the welcome section that you're seeing right now. But we have guidelines that we published on the interoperability assessments that are available there. You can draft the report that you need to do on interoperability assessments, but you can also publish reports if you've written them beforehand. You can discover existing reports, but as I mentioned before, the obligation only started on January 12th, so there's no reports yet. But we also have the assessment forum where you can share your experiences, you can read up on additional information, and you can interact with other people in the community. And actually what I would like to go in depth to now is to show you the assessment guidelines, what it looks like on the portal, so you can see for yourself. We wrote these guidelines in co-creation with the member states. And I know Eva said that I'm one of the parents of the assessment guidelines, but much like in real life, it takes a village. So we actually wrote these together with a lot of support from not only our unit, but in actual co-creation with the member states. So we met several times. We wrote the different chapters together, we re-evaluated them, we piloted the guidelines. And in the version you can find now that was adopted on December 5th last year, that is actually the result of all the work that we did together. And you can find them on the portal here as an interactive version. So you can click through the different chapters, for example. And the chapters cover the basic things in the beginning. What are interoperability assessments? Why are they relevant? The second chapter focuses on what I showed you today, is when is an interoperability assessment legally required, actually. The third chapter, I think, will be the most important one for you. It's how to carry out an interoperability assessment. And then the last chapters focus on how to document it and how you can establish a sound governance around the interoperability assessments. And then in chapter 6, there's further resources, and you can click through all these chapters on the website. In chapter 2, there's also an interactive decision tree where you can find out whether you have to do an interoperability assessment or not. But you can also just download the document. This is what it looks like. And translations will be available soon in each of the member state languages. And we also have another offer, which is the Interoperable Europe Academy, where if you're unfamiliar with some of the concepts that we talked about today, whether it be the European Interoperability Framework, the Act itself, or interoperability in the first place, but also more technical things, if you want to go more into depth, like core vocabularies, or the European Interoperability Reference Architecture, you can find on the Interoperable Europe Academy. They're courses of around 30 minutes, but they can also be longer. You can get certificates for some of the courses and just find a lot of information if you want to go more into depth on the different concepts that I talked about today. And soon there will also be one course on the interoperability assessments. And because this is also part of the Digital-ready Policymaking, there's also a class on Digital-ready Policymaking that you can attend. Oops, I'm sorry. And yeah, there's 2 different ways you can access the Academy. You can join the collection on the portal, where you will then also get information on events that might be taking place or new courses that are being uploaded. Or you can also access them directly on the EU Academy page. And with that, I will go back to the Slido that we shared at the beginning. I know this has been a lot of input, and I'm sure a lot of questions have come up. So if you have other topics that you would like to have addressed in future sessions, you can give us your answer here by this QR code. we would be super interested in hearing what you think we should be talking about in the next webinars. And I can already tell you that there will be more webinars, focusing also more in depth on specific parts of the assessment and every concept that surrounds it, basically. So happy to hear what you actually want to learn about. And with that, I will give back over to Eva.
Thanks a lot, Felicitas. I will stop the recording now and open the floor to Q&A